day, my friends. It's your old pal Jordan the Lion. How are you all doing today? I hope you said great. I'm doing great. We are coming to you from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and today we are going to be talking about the French chef, Julia Child. Now, Julia Child has a really interesting story because, she didn't even become a television personality that we would all know until she was like 52 years old. So we're going to talk a lot about her today, and I'm going to show you where her bizarre grave is. So this is really bizarre because not only is it an unorthodox grave, but it's also kind of surprising that she wasn't buried in either Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she made her home, France, where she loved to be the most, or even Pasadena, California, where she's from. So let's go see where Julia Child's final resting place is. Daze with Jordan the Lion, it begins right now. So Julia Child was born and raised in a pretty wealthy family, well-to-do Republican family in Pasadena, California. And so she said when she was growing up, she never saw her mother cook. She never learned how to cook herself, and basically just accepted, or seemingly, that she would live a life the way her family did, where she would have a cook. And at that time, women didn't really have professions, so she knew she would go to school, she would go to college, and then she didn't really know what would happen after that. Now, she was very large. She was 6'2". Every one of her siblings were over 6 feet, and she had a brother and a sister, and she decided to eventually end up going to college, as I said, and then her mother ended up passing away, and she came home to take care of her father. But when World War II broke out, the country needed everyone, and she thought, well, I'm not really doing anything anyway, and so she decided to enlist because she wanted to be a spy. She actually thought that, being 6'2", no one would ever suspect her of being a spy. So unfortunately, she didn't get that dream. She ended up enlisting, and they gave her basically a secretarial job, but in a precursor to the CIA. So she did work in the intelligence bureau and was seeing a lot of secret classified documents and everything, but she was not a spy. Sometimes you see online people will say that she was a spy, but she was not. So she had an opportunity at one point they were looking for people that were willing to go Far East, and she volunteered. And so she was sent to Sri Lanka, where this was like an eye-opener for her because she was not married. She had someone that had proposed to her. It was actually an heir to the Los Angeles Times, and she just felt like she would live a boring life if she had went with them. So while she was in Sri Lanka, she starts working with a man that's about 10 years older than her. His profession was the maps. He was responsible. He was the head of all the maps for the US government in Sri Lanka. And so she met this man named Paul, and she would write in her journals that, she wasn't attracted to him, but she did find him very interesting because he was so smart. And it's interesting that he was so smart because he never went to any kind of schooling, really. He was all really self-taught in everything. So she and Paul were stationed there together, and then eventually they were sent to China. And when they went to China, somewhere along the line, they fell in love. All the things that he didn't like about her, he would say that he thought that her giggle was obnoxious and she just did it too much and things like that. All of a sudden, everything that he really didn't like about her, he started to love, and they fell in love. So here are the offices of the Neptune Memorial Reef. And Julia Child decided to, she had a long, happy life. She lived into her 90s, of course. Ended up passing of kidney failure, outliving her beloved husband, Paul. And I would have thought they would have been buried together. But Julia's grave began here. Here, she would have made arrangements for her ashes to actually be buried at sea. You see, Neptune's Memorial Reef, it's actually 3.5 miles off the coast of Miami, and it is a reef that you can snorkel or dive to, and that's where her remains will be forever. Now, it's a really interesting thing. You never hear of something like that. You hear people being scattered at sea, but you hardly ever hear of someone making arrangements for their ashes to be snorkeled underwater. And I'm going to show you some pictures, and they've created this amazing graveyard underwater. They said that they do a couple of tours a day out there, and the boat takes you off 3.5 miles off, and you can dive if you're certified, or snorkel. This looks like these are some of the headstones that you can get to put there at your final resting place if you would decide to do that. And then here's the actual location. Now, I usually really like to go and pay respects as close as I possibly can, but you know what? I am not much of a sea life fan. I really don't like the idea of snorkeling or scuba diving. That's just not something I'm into, so I'm going to show you the photos from her grave here. While doing the show, Julia Child did end up finding out that she had cancer and she had to have one of her breasts removed, and she was just completely devastated by this. She felt like Paul would not love her anymore, and one day he walked in, found her crying, and asked her what was the matter, and she said, "How could you ever love me looking like this?" And he looked at her and he said, "Well, I didn't fall in love with you because of your breasts. I fell in love with you because of your legs." And she said she never worried about it ever since. That was a very beautiful thing about their relationship, was that for, you know, all the people around them that maybe, like a lot of people would say, they felt uncomfortable around Paul because they really didn't get him. They didn't really understand his personality. For as many people as were kind of confused by the difference in their personality, it was unmistakable when you saw them together how much in love they were. And even when he had a heart attack and a stroke and started showing signs of dementia, she took him to France, and they lived in France as long as they could together until she sadly had to put him in a retirement home, a nursing home. She said it was the saddest day of her life because she had put things from around their house in his room the first day that she took him there, and he looked at her and said, "Why am I here? What are we doing here?" And she just had to explain to him that, "Oh, we're just doing this for one night, and then we'll be going home and everything." And she went out to her car and just absolutely cried. Paul opened her eyes to all the things she had never seen before. She knew there was more out there, she just didn't know what. And so they ended up getting married. Her father did not particularly care for Paul because Paul was a Democrat and basically was the exact opposite of her father, but she loved everything about Paul, and the longer they were together, the more they complimented each other, not only verbally, but in all of their actions, and they would grow more in love. So Paul ended up, when the war ended, they decided to send Paul to France because he was very fluent in French speaking. And so while they were there, Julia had found French cooking. She tried a piece of sole fish one night and fell in love. And eventually he was stationed over in Paris, and she really fell in love with the city there. She just felt like she could live there forever given the opportunity. But it was actually during her time in Paris that, you know, she loved the cooking so much, and the GI Bill would pay for returning veterans to have a career. And so she ended up going to Le Cordon Bleu, which was a famous French culinary school, and at that time there was really only men taking the classes. You know, as far as being a chef, it was kind of frowned upon for women to be in the kitchen in a restaurant. It was like an art, they found. And when she took the course, it was all GIs, and they were all men except for her. Now, she loved Le Cordon Bleu. She loved cooking and would cook for some of her friends while she was taking the course. And some of her American friends would say, "You have to teach me how to cook. I want to pay you to take cooking classes." And she didn't felt that she was really ready to do that, but she had a couple of friends that were really great French chefs that were women, and she asked them, and so the three of them taught 6 women in Julia's home the very first time that Julia would teach anyone. And those women actually had something going on. They were working on a book that they wanted to create French recipes for Americans, so American products could be used to make these recipes. And so Julia and the women started working on it, but Paul got stationed somewhere else in France, so they weren't living close to each other any longer to work on the book, so they would do it through the mail, where her partners would write out what they wanted the recipes to be, send them to Julia, and Julia would have to work with the recipes, try different things, try different products to try and make them work. She ended up sending off the recipes after 12 years of working on this book, and they ended up getting, first the first publisher they sent it to said, you know, you're too detailed. Julia found that in cooking books, the thing she didn't like about it was that most of the time they had the recipe, but they didn't really tell you how to make the stuff. So she really got into detail in her cooking book when she was doing the translation, because they brought her in to give like an American feel to it and everything. But then, you know, once the publisher saw it, they thought it would be too much for Americans. She actually said, you know, Americans want easy cooking, fast cooking, convenient cooking, and you're just too wordy. So then another publisher found the book and said, this is exactly what the world needs. It was Julia and her friends' attempt at, it was called Mastering French Cuisine, that went on to become a bestseller. But it was because of that book that she ended up getting her cooking show. Her husband Paul eventually was brought back to America, and then he was accused of being a communist. And then he was accused of being homosexual, and he was neither one, but he was so embarrassed because he had been married to Julia for years. He was so embarrassed that he decided to retire from the military. So when the book came out, Julia was asked to appear on PBS in Boston and do a little cooking demonstration to promote the book. And so she decided to make an omelet and made the most perfect omelet that the host had ever had. And for the first time, PBS in Boston said they were getting phone calls of people being excited, and they said, hey, maybe we should give her her own show. And so that's what they did. The French Chef began on PBS in 1962, and Julia became a household favorite. People loved the way that she would slap the food around and throw it around, and when she would make mistakes, she would say that that was okay. And there was just something relatable that people loved about her. And even though PBS didn't have much of a budget, they got a kind of like a demo kitchen donated to them for the show. And Paul would, since he was now no longer working, he would throw himself into this. He would write cue cards for her, helping make bullet points for the show when they were recording, because they had to basically just do it live on the spot. And she would also have to sometimes pre-prepare, where she would have to have like 3 different chickens at 3 different stages of cooking, because they were trying to do a 26-minute show and they were trying to get everything in. So they would have to show the food preparation in different stages along the show lines. But she did this for so long and continued to create more and more cooking books, became more and more of a fixture on television shows, and really, people say she was the reason, she was the first star of PBS. She was the reason that people wanted to actually make something interesting in their home, something they thought that they had to go to a restaurant for. They now found out that they could get this in their home. Eventually realized that PBS didn't seem to be interested in working with her as much anymore. She thought it was because of her age. And so she ended up leaving and going and working on Good Morning America, and continued to cook, continued to work on books and work on projects all the way up until her death. Rest in peace, Julia Child. Bon appetit.